when you are a child, the world is usually presented to you in these very neat, very comforting binaries.
Oh, absolutely. Like, the sky is up, the ground is down.
Right. You do something good, you get a reward. You do something bad, you get a timeout.
It's totally transactional.
Yeah. And there is this, I guess, baked-in expectation that every single question you could possibly ask has a simple, clean, perfectly packaged answer.
Right, because kids crave that simplicity.
Exactly. Like if you ask an adult why the sky is blue, you expect them to just hand you the truth, wrapped up with a bow, and you just move on with your day.
It is the absolute definition of a black and white worldview. And, it makes total sense why we start there developmentally.
Because you need it.
Yeah, we need things to be visible, categorized, and above all, emotionally comforting before we can handle the actual chaos of reality.
But then, as you grow up, you inevitably step into the world of adult morality.
Which is messy.
So messy. You start reading history, you start looking at philosophy, you watch the evening news, and suddenly those neat little boxes just completely shatter.
The answers are definitely no longer simple.
No, they aren't. Which brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable question of adult life, and the entire focus of our deep dive today.
Can you be good without a God?
That's the one. And honestly, beyond just that specific question, we have to ask if the way we currently argue about, religion, science, and morality is just completely and utterly broken.
To figure this out, we are looking at a stack of sources today that is, frankly, incredibly diverse.
It's a really wild mix.
It really is. We are synthesizing Christopher Hitchens' fiery, world-famous anti-theist manifesto, God is Not Great.
A heavy hitter for sure.
Yeah. And then we are also looking at a global academic critique by Stephen E. Gregg, who analyzes the mechanics of the whole new atheism debate.
Right. And to cap it off, we have a practical, illustrated youth guide to humanism published by the Italian Union of Rationalist Atheists and Agnostics.
The UAR.
Right, the UARR. But before we tear into the actual arguments, I need to lay down a crucial ground rule for you, the listener.
Very important disclaimer here.
Yes. You probably already know these tests touch on highly charged political, social, and religious arguments from, multiple sides of the spectrum.
Oh, definitely. We're talking intense critiques.
Exactly. We are going to be unpacking intense critiques of the Catholic Church, of Islam, of conservative theological views, and deep, deep debates over sexuality and politics.
Which means we need to be clear about our role.
Crystal clear. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of these authors, whether they're left-wing, right-wing, atheist, or religious.
Not at all.
Our sole job today is to impartially report on and unpack the ideas contained in this original source material so you can understand the actual landscape of this debate.
Right. Our goal here is purely comprehension. We are getting under the hood to look at the mechanics of these arguments, to see how these authors are building their worldviews.
And to do that, we're going to start with a childhood lesson about the color of grass.
A classic.
Then we are going to travel through the really dark mechanics of the Spanish Inquisition.
Yep.
And we will somehow end up examining a proudly atheist UFO religion that distributes condoms in Montreal.
It's going to be quite the journey.
It really is. So if Hitchens' book is the prosecution's opening statement against faith, I want to start by looking at where his specific brand of prosecution actually comes from.
It is a vital place to start because Christopher Hitchens is just a fascinating figure in this landscape.
He really is. He was a prolific journalist, essayist, and arguably the most aggressive voice of the new atheism movement.
Right. But what stands out about his origin story, which he details early in his book, is what didn't happen to him.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, he didn't suffer some terrible religious trauma. He calls himself a Protestant atheist.
Oh, right. He wasn't abused by a rigid church hierarchy as a child.
Exactly. He was just an intellectually restless kid. The spark of his lifelong doubt didn't come from a textbook or a trauma. It came from a completely mundane interaction with his favorite childhood teacher.
Mrs. Jean Watts.
Yes. The story of the green grass.
This is such a brilliant distillation of his entire problem with religious thinking. Hitchens recounts being a young boy in a standard Church of England religious lesson.
Just a normal day in class.
Yeah. And Mrs. Watts asks the children a seemingly innocent question: why is the grass green?
Now, she isn't setting them up for a science lesson, obviously.
No, not at all. She tells the classroom that God made the grass green because green is the most restful color for human eyes.
Which is such a specific theological leap.
Right. And she asks these kids to imagine how strange and chaotic and exhausting it would be if all the grass in the world were, bright orange or purple.
And Hitchens notes that even as a young boy, long before he knew absolutely anything about photosynthesis
Or chlorophyll.
or evolutionary biology, he felt an immediate, visceral sense of cognitive dissonance. His gut just told him this is completely wrong.
But wait, why though? As a kid, that sounds like a lovely, comforting story. The creator loves you so much he painted the ground your favorite, most relaxing color.
Right, it sounds sweet on the surface.
So what was it about that specific explanation that bothered a 9-year-old?
Because even at that age, Hitchens recognized the staggering arrogance embedded in the story.
Arrogance.
Yeah, it felt engineered. It is a story designed to make humans feel like the absolute center of the universe.
Oh, I see.
It reverses the logical flow of reality. Instead of humans evolving eyes that are adapted to the natural environment, meaning we find green restful because we evolved surrounded by it.
Where that's just basic biology.
Exactly. But the story claims the entire biological complexity of the Earth was decorated specifically to soothe our optic nerves.
It's putting the cart before the horse on a cosmic scale.
Exactly. And that realization becomes the core premise of his entire life's work.
Wow. From one little lesson about grass.
Yeah. Hitchens argues that religion fundamentally misrepresents human origins. It gets our starting point wrong.
And because it misrepresents where we come from and our place in the cosmos, it inevitably leads to a cascade of dangerous human behaviors.
Precisely. He categorizes the primary symptoms of this as servility, solipsism, wish-thinking, and sexual repression.
Solipsism being exactly what that grass story illustrates, right? This deeply arrogant idea that the cosmos is a theater built entirely for our benefit.
Yes, that's exactly it.
And servility is the flip side of that coin. Like, you are the center of the universe, but you must act as a groveling servant to the divine dictator who built it for you.
Yes. And Hitchens argues these aren't just abstract philosophical flaws that people debate in ivory towers.
No, he thinks they're real threats.
He views them as active, lethal dangers. He doesn't see religion as a passive, comforting blanket for the masses. I mean, his second chapter is bluntly titled, Religion Kills.
That is blunt.
Yeah. He views faith as a direct catalyst for systemic violence and systemic oppression.
He brings up the 1996 Irish divorce referendum, which I think is a perfect example of how he sees this playing out in the real world.
Oh, that's a really powerful example.
So at the time, divorce was entirely illegal in Ireland, largely due to the historically heavy influence of Catholic leadership on the state constitution.
Right.
Activists were trying to pass a referendum to change the law, and their primary argument was human rights.
Basically, they needed a legal mechanism to allow abused women to escape horrific, violent marriages.
Exactly. And Hitchens points his spotlight directly at the intervention of Mother Teresa.
This is where it gets really controversial.
Oh, yeah. She flew all the way from India to Ireland specifically to urge Irish voters to vote no.
To keep the ban on divorce in place.
Yes. She threw her immense global moral weight behind the church hardliners to ensure that women in abusive, and in some cases incestuous, marriages had absolutely no legal avenue of escape.
And Hitchens sharply contrasts that exact political campaign with her behavior just a short time later.
Oh, when she was advising Princess Diana.
Right. Diana was famously miserable in her marriage to Prince Charles, and Mother Teresa publicly offered her grace, essentially saying that sometimes it is better to leave.
That is quite the double standard.
Hitchens certainly thought so. He uses this to highlight what he views as the ultimate hypocrisy of religious power structures.
That they enforce brutal, rigid, unforgiving laws on the poor and the vulnerable, while offering quiet grace and exceptions to the rich, the famous, and the powerful.
Exactly. The mechanism he is trying to expose there is that religion, by its very nature, cannot just stay in its own lane.
Right. It always wants to expand.
It is never content with just organizing its own internal practices or managing its own flock. It inherently seeks to interfere with the lives of others.
Non-believers, secular citizens, or followers of other faiths.
Yeah. It demands power in this world, not just the next, because it believes it speaks for the ultimate authority.
He has this incredible anecdote about a panel he was on with the conservative religious broadcaster Dennis Prager.
Oh, the alleyway hypothetical?
Yes. This happened just a week before 9/11. Prager challenges Hitchens in front of the audience with what he thinks is a slam-dunk hypothetical scenario.
He's trying to trap him.
Totally. He says to Hitchens, imagine you are in a strange city at dusk. You are walking alone, and a large group of men is approaching you in a dark alley.
Okay, spooky setup.
Right. And Prager asks, would you feel safer or less safe if you learned those men had just come from a prayer meeting?
Right, so Prager intends it to be a trap. It is a binary question that inherently assumes religious observance is the universal proxy for moral safety.
Like men who pray are automatically good guys.
Exactly. The assumption is that men who pray are inherently less likely to commit violence than men who don't.
But Hitchens completely dismantles the premise.
It's such a good rhetorical pivot.
He answers that he doesn't need to imagine this hypothetical because he has lived it as a journalist.
He's actually been in those alleys.
Exactly. He tells Prager that just staying within cities that start with the letter B, he has had that exact experience in Belfast, Beirut, Bombay, Belgrade, Bethlehem, and Baghdad.
Wow. The letter B cities.
Yeah. And he says that in every single one of those cities, if a group of men in an alley were coming from a religious observance, he would feel immediately physically and mortally threatened.
It is just a devastating counter. He takes a soft hypothetical designed to prove religion's inherent benevolence and smashes it into the stark, violent reality of late 20th century geopolitical conflict.
He really forces the audience to acknowledge that in many parts of the world, intense religious fervor is the clearest predictor of sectarian violence.
Yes.
Okay, but let me push back on Hitchens here for a second because I can hear the historical counter-argument forming.
Go for it.
Isn't he just confusing territorial, political, or ethnic wars with religious ones?
That's a common critique, yeah.
I mean, Belfast was fundamentally about British colonial rule versus Irish independence. Baghdad was deeply political and territorial. Belgrade was ethnic. So is it really fair, or even historically accurate, to blame the philosophical concept of a creator god for standard human tribal warfare over land and resources?
That is precisely the standard and perhaps most robust critique of Hitchens' worldview.
So how does he defend against that?
His counterargument is very specific. He doesn't deny that humans will fight over land or resources. He knows we are tribal.
Okay.
But what he argues is that religion institutionalizes, exacerbates, and uniquely sanctifies those tribal differences. Let's look closely at his example of Beirut.
Right, let's unpack Beirut.
When he first visited Beirut in 1975, it was incredibly diverse, cosmopolitan, literally known as the Paris of the Orient.
Right.
But the problem, as Hitchens saw it, was that the state constitution formally accommodated different religions by institutionalizing them directly into the government structure.
Oh, right. I remember reading this. The Constitution literally mandated that the president of the country had to be a Maronite Christian.
Yes.
And the prime minister had to be a Sunni Muslim. And the speaker of the parliament had to be a Shia Muslim.
Exactly. It wasn't a secular state where religion was a private matter kept separate from governance.
It was hardwired in.
Right. The state itself codified a religious hierarchy and baked sectarian identity into the distribution of political power.
So you couldn't just be a citizen. You were your religion first.
Exactly. Christians were structurally at the top. Shia Muslims were largely at the bottom as a disenfranchised underclass.
And Hitchens argues that this didn't keep the peace.
Far from it. He argues this religious institutionalization didn't prevent conflict. It directly paved the way for the massacres of the 1980s.
Wow.
When tensions rose over resources and demographics, the conflict immediately became religious. Christian and Jewish sects rallied against the Muslim underclass, which then catalyzed the rise of militant groups like Hezbollah.
So his argument is that religion wasn't just an incidental label the fighters happened to wear.
Exactly. It was the very mechanism of the oppression and the violence.
It takes something that could just be a mundane dispute over borders or economics and turns it into a divine mandate.
And once it's a divine mandate, you can't back down.
You aren't just fighting your neighbor for a slightly better piece of farmland. You are fighting the eternal enemies of God, which means compromise becomes mathematically impossible.
Precisely. In a political dispute, you can split the difference. You can draw a new border. You can share the water rights.
You can negotiate.
Right. But how do you compromise on the absolute revealed will of the divine? You can't. To compromise is to commit heresy. That is how, according to Hitchens, religion poisons the political process.
Man. So if that is how he thinks it infects macro geopolitics, I want to talk about how he thinks it infects daily life. Which brings us to the short digression on the pig.
It is a brilliant pivot in his book.
It really is.
He moves from the destruction of whole cities to the microbiological taboos that dictate what people eat on a Tuesday.
Right. He takes a long look at the Jewish and Muslim dietary laws that strictly forbid the consumption of pork.
And this is something people debate all the time.
Yeah. Now, if you ask a modern, secular, rationalist person why that taboo exists, The standard explanation is usually public health.
The old trichinosis argument.
Exactly. People say, well, ancient pigs carried trichinosis and other parasites. Without modern cooking methods, eating pork in a hot climate was just dangerous.
It makes logical sense on the surface.
Right, so the theory goes that early religious leaders were essentially just acting as rudimentary public health officials, banning a dangerous food source to protect the tribe.
But Hitchens rejects that secular environmental theory entirely.
He does, and the way he debunks it is fascinating. He points to the actual archaeological record.
Right, he looks at the dirt.
Yes. If you look at dig sites in ancient Canaan, you see very few pig bones in early Jewish settlements.
Which is what you'd expect.
That makes sense. But if you look at the neighboring non-Jewish populations from the exact same era,
Living right next door.
right, living in the exact same climate, with the exact same level of cooking technology, their middens are just full of pig bones.
They were eating pigs constantly.
And the crucial data point there is the survival rate.
Because if the pigs were that deadly, those neighbors should have been dropping like flies.
Exactly. There is absolutely no historical or archaeological evidence of a massively higher death rate from trichinosis among those neighboring tribes.
They survived just fine.
They thrived. So the public health argument completely collapses. The environment was the same, the biology was the same, ergo, the taboo is ideological, not epidemiological.
So if it wasn't a primitive FDA regulation, what is his mechanism for how a taboo like that actually starts?
Right, because a society doesn't just wake up one morning and decide to permanently ban a cheap, abundant, easily domesticated food source without a profound psychological reason.
Right, and here's where his theory gets deeply unsettling.
It really does.
Hitchens theorizes that the taboo evolved because pigs are actually uncomfortably, horrifyingly similar to humans.
In terms of both genetics and behavior?
Yes. Even modern medicine relies on this similarity. We use pig valves for human heart transplants. We use pig skin for burn victims.
It's kind of wild when you think about it.
It is. Hitchens points out that to ancient cultures, slaughtering a pig was a uniquely disturbing experience.
The sounds they make.
Yes. The screams of a dying pig sound incredibly similar to the screams of a human being. They are visibly intelligent social animals.
And famously, their flesh looks and reportedly tastes very similar to human flesh.
It is the uncanny valley of the animal kingdom.
That's the perfect way to phrase it. And Hitchens connects this psychological discomfort to the ancient practice of human sacrifice.
He theorizes that as early Abrahamic tribes began to civilize, as human sacrifice began to decline and become deeply taboo, the consumption of an animal that was so viscerally reminiscent of a human also became strictly taboo.
It was just too close for comfort.
Exactly. And what makes this digression so important to his larger argument is how he traces the mutation of that taboo over centuries.
Right, it doesn't just stay a weird dietary quirk.
No. A psychological quirk born in the desert thousands of years ago mutates into an instrument of immense cruelty during the Spanish Inquisition.
This part was terrifying to read. The Inquisition used the pork taboo as a literal weapon.
They really did.
They would host these massive formal events, essentially forced banquets, and they would serve giant platters of pork products.
It's just piled high with ham.
Yeah. And Christian inquisitors would meticulously watch the crowd to see who eagerly ate the pork and who politely declined or tried to hide their portions.
It was a trap.
A terrifying purity test to identify hidden Jews and Muslims heretics who had publicly converted to Christianity but were secretly maintaining their faith and their dietary laws.
And the stakes couldn't have been higher. Refusing a slice of ham could literally lead to the torture chamber.
It's unbelievable. And Hitchens notes that this visceral, entirely irrational hatred of the pig persists today, often mutating into bizarre modern censorship.
Right. He cites modern protests in certain Islamic schools against the teaching of George Orwell's Animal Farm.
Just because the primary characters are anthropomorphized pigs.
Exactly. Or widespread campaigns to ban Winnie the Pooh merchandise because of the character Piglet.
Piglet.
I know. He is showing how a completely unscientific ancient neurosis survives for millennia to police modern thought.
He basically describes religion as behaving less like a philosophy and more like a biological virus.
That's a great analogy.
It doesn't just infect your mind with bad ideas. It physically mutates to attack human health, which is central to his next major argument, where he looks at how dogma actively worsens global health crises.
Right. He focuses intensely on the intersection of religious authority and modern medicine. He specifically looks at the polio eradication efforts and the AIDS crisis.
So with polio, you had a disease that the global scientific community was on the absolute verge of totally eradicating in the early 2000s.
We were so close.
Thanks to massive, coordinated vaccination efforts by groups like the WHO and UNICEF. But in areas like northern Nigeria, certain local Muslim religious leaders began actively spreading rumors from the pulpit.
Deadly rumors.
Yeah. They claimed the polio vaccine was a Western plot designed to sterilize Muslim girls and destroy the Islamic population.
And people believed it.
Of course they did. It came from their leaders. Because of this religious decree, immense numbers of people skipped the crucial doses, and polio came roaring back.
Paralyzing children in areas where it had essentially been wiped out.
It's heartbreaking. And when he turns to the AIDS crisis, the interference is even more direct, institutional, and widespread.
Hitchens details the Catholic Church's aggressive, well-funded campaign against condom use, particularly in Africa where the epidemic was decimating entire generations.
And church leaders didn't just preach abstinence, right? They actively spread a scientifically absurd, lethal lie.
The microscopic holes lie.
Yes. They claim that condoms have microscopic holes in them that allow the HIV virus to pass through, rendering them completely useless.
Which is just biologically, medically false. And Islamic authorities in various regions similarly condemned condoms, claiming that the disease could be prevented simply by adhering to strict religious sexual morals.
It is staggering when you think about the death toll associated with that kind of misinformation.
It is. Hitchens is basically arguing that when religious dogma encounters a biological crisis, it will invariably choose the preservation of its own sexual taboos over the preservation of actual human life.
He points to male and female circumcision as another symptom of this. Permanent, non-consensual bodily alterations driven entirely by ancient texts, not medical necessity.
And he ties all of this back to his core thesis of sexual repression. He argues that major religious institutions teach that human sexuality is inherently sinful or shameful.
And they enforce unnatural, lifelong celibacy on their leadership class.
Right, and Hitchens argues that this immense systemic repression doesn't eliminate sexual desire, it warps it.
It twists it into something dark.
Exactly. He draws a direct line between the institutional demand for celibacy and the horrific, systematic sexual abuse scandals we've seen covered up, particularly within the Catholic Church. In his view, repression inevitably breeds deviancy and violence.
Okay, so if I'm tracking the entire prosecution's case here, Hitchens says religion tells us arrogant lies about our origins to make us feel special.
Check.
It demands blind, servile obedience to dictators.
Check.
It institutionalizes tribal differences and sparks endless, uncompromisable wars.
Yeah.
It enforces absurd, unscientific taboos that lead to torture and censorship. It actively spreads disease by fighting medical science, and it warps human sexuality into something dangerous.
That is the complete list. He looks at all of this and literally concludes that religion poisons everything.
It is an incredibly potent, uncompromising critique.
It really is. But, and this is the big, but it creates a massive philosophical vacuum.
What do you mean?
Well, if we take Hitchens at his word, if we assume he is entirely right and we decide to tear down the entire religious framework that has organized human society, laws, and morality for the last several millennia,
Okay.
what exactly happens next?
Right. You can't just leave a void.
No, you can't.
If there is no God handing down the Ten Commandments, how do we know what is good? How do we build a justice system? How do we organize a society without collapsing into total chaos?
And that brings us perfectly to the second massive piece of our puzzle today. The Youth Guide to Humanism, published by the Italian Union of Rationalist Atheists and Agnostics.
The UAR guide.
Yes. This document is crucial because it pivots away from the purely destructive critique of the new atheists. It moves from what we shouldn't believe to what we can build.
It's proactive.
Highly proactive. It attempts to map out humanism not just as a lack of faith, but as a rigorous ethical life stance.
Okay, so to understand how they build this framework from scratch, we have to look at how they define the starting point of morality, right?
Exactly. The guide starts by tackling the concept of the individual, and it draws a stark, fundamental contrast with traditional religious philosophies.
How so?
Religion, they argue, almost universally relies on a concept called heteronomy.
Heteronomy. Okay, let's break that down.
Well, it is the linchpin concept here. It comes from the Greek roots for other and law.
Other law. Okay.
Right. In a moral sense, it means relying on an external authority to define right and wrong.
So you don't do what is right because you independently deduced it.
Exactly. You do it because the church or the infallible scripture or the ancient tradition dictates it. Your morality is handed to you from the outside.
You're just following orders.
Pretty much. And humanism flips that dynamic entirely upside down. It places the individual human being at the absolute center of the moral universe.
They quote the great liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill in this section, don't they?
They do. They quote his famous line, "Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign."
Sovereign, that's a powerful word.
It is. That concept of individual sovereignty is the bedrock. It means granting intrinsic dignity and rights to people as individuals purely by virtue of their humanity.
Not based on their utility to the state.
Nope. And definitely not based on what group they happen to belong to.
The guide specifically contrasts this humanist approach with both fundamentalisms and nationalisms, which they see as variations of the same toxic groupthink.
Right, because nationalism tells you that you have rights and dignity only because you were accidentally born on this specific patch of dirt.
And people born on the other side of the river have less value.
Exactly. And fundamentalism tells you that you have dignity only if you adhere to our specific interpretation of a specific holy book.
And in both of those systems, if you step out of line,
if you become a traitor or an apostate,
you lose your rights, your dignity, and often your life.
Which humanism rejects entirely. You have dignity because you are a human being, full stop. No other qualifiers needed.
I love that.
Yeah.
But if you remove that external authority, if there is no holy book telling you what is true, and no priest telling you what is moral, how do you actually make decisions?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. How do you investigate the world and know that what you are looking at is real?
You use what the guide calls the multi-tool.
Oh, I loved this visual. They use this great practical visual of reason functioning like a Swiss Army knife.
Yes. Humanism actively, consciously rejects the traditional sources of knowledge that heteronymous religions rely on.
It rejects authority. Just because a pope or a king says something is true doesn't make it true.
Right. It rejects tradition. Just because our ancestors did something for 1,000 years doesn't mean it is effective or moral.
It rejects instinct, it rejects mysticism, and it wholly rejects fear as a motivator for belief.
Instead of those things, it relies entirely on reason and the scientific method.
They explicitly point back to Galilei as the pioneer of this process, right?
They do. You observe the natural world, you form a hypothesis, you conduct a rigorous experiment, and you build a theory based solely on the verifiable data.
But, and this is a massive distinction that I think a lot of critics of secularism miss,
Yeah.
they don't just take God off the altar and replace him with a glowing microscope.
That is such an important point. They do not worship science.
No, they don't.
And this is perhaps the most sophisticated point in the guide. They reference the Amsterdam Declaration of 2002.
Which is essentially the global manifesto of modern humanist thought.
Right. The Declaration explicitly outlines the inherent limits of science. It states very clearly, science gives us the means, but human values must propose the ends.
Science gives us the means, human values propose the ends. I love that phrase, because it is so incredibly grounded in reality.
It really puts science in its proper place as a tool.
Exactly. Science is a tool. It can tell us exactly how to split the atom. It gives us the means.
But the scientific method cannot tell us whether we should use that incredible knowledge to build a nuclear reactor to safely power a hospital.
Or whether we should use it to build a thermonuclear warhead to vaporize a city.
Right. Data has no morality. The decision of what to do with the data requires human values. Science desperately needs the supervision of humanist empathy.
Because without that overarching empathy, pure, unrestrained reason can be incredibly cold, utilitarian, and even destructive.
We have seen historical regimes attempt to use pure science to justify horrific eugenics programs.
It's terrifying. So the Humanist Project requires both the engine of science and the steering wheel of empathy.
Well said.
So if we have these sovereign individuals and they are using reason guided by empathy, how do they actually structure a government? How do they live together without tearing each other apart?
The guide brings in the philosopher Immanuel Kant to answer this, and they use a quote that is profoundly realistic, even a bit cynical.
Oh, I know the one. From such crooked wood as that which man is made of, nothing straight can be fashioned.
It is a total rejection of utopian thinking.
They aren't saying humans are perfect angels waiting to be unleashed.
No, they recognize that human nature is flawed, selfish, and messy. They aren't trying to build heaven on earth. They are trying to build a functional shelter.
And they use a beautiful visual analogy to explain why democracy is the best tool for this shelter.
The town in the valley.
Right. Imagine human society as a town, and this town is built in a valley, squeezed between a massive mountain on one side and a raging river on the other.
Okay, so if it rains heavily, the town is threatened by massive landslides from the mountain.
And the mountain represents anarchy. It is the total lack of rules, the state of nature, where the strong simply devour the weak, and society collapses into chaotic violence.
But the town is equally threatened by floods from the river.
And the river represents totalitarianism. This is where the state or the religious authority overflows its banks and completely drowns the individual, controlling every aspect of their life.
So where does democracy fit into this dangerous geography?
Democracy isn't a magical spell that makes the mountain or the river disappear.
It's not a cure-all.
No. Democracy is the constant, grueling, unglamorous collective work of building levees against the river of tyranny and building retaining walls against the mountain of anarchy.
It is not a perfect finished utopia.
It is a sweaty, difficult construction site. It is the continuous daily work of managing our crooked wood.
It is deeply imperfect, it is often frustrating, and it requires constant vigilance, but it's the only structural system that keeps the town from being destroyed.
And one of the most vital structural levees in that entire democratic system is the principle of secularism.
Which, as the guide rightly points out, is massively misunderstood by the general public.
Oh, entirely misunderstood. When a lot of people hear the word secularism, they instantly think of state-sponsored atheism.
Right, they picture the Soviet Union blowing up churches and throwing priests in the gulag.
But the guide is very clear. Secularism is not an anti-religious stance.
It is a political boundary line. It is a structural necessity designed specifically to prevent theocracy.
They use this mind-bending thought experiment that really made the mechanics of secularism click for me.
The 100% Catholic country.
Yes. They ask the reader to imagine a hypothetical country that is 100% Catholic. There are literally 0 atheists, 0 Muslims, 0 Hindus, 0 Protestants in this country.
Every single citizen is a baptized Catholic.
The guide argues that even in that culturally monolithic country, you still desperately need a secular government.
Wait, why? If everyone agrees on the religion, why do they need a secular state?
Because you need the levy to protect the liberal Catholic from the fundamentalist Catholic.
Ah.
If there is no secular boundary keeping the church out of the state apparatus, the most extreme fundamentalist faction will inevitably seize the levers of government.
And once they do,
They will use the police power of the state to enforce their specific, rigid interpretation of the faith on everyone else.
they will make attending Sunday Mass legally mandatory.
They will legally ban birth control. They will throw you in jail for missing confession.
Wow.
Secularism is the only mechanism that protects freedom of religion just as much as freedom from religion. It protects the moderate believer from the extremist living inside their own house.
It is a brilliant, highly effective way to reframe the argument. Secularism isn't a weapon designed to attack faith. It's a shield designed to defend individual conscience.
And from that solid structural foundation, the Humanist Guide outlines the specific modern battles they feel compelled to fight.
Because if you truly believe that the individual is sovereign, you can't just write that down in a manifesto.
Right.
You have to actively fight for those individuals in the real world when they are oppressed.
And they are very explicit and unapologetic about their stances. For instance, they advocate strongly for feminism.
But they take care to define it, which is interesting.
Yeah, they don't define it as misandry or the reversal of power dynamics. They define it as the mathematically necessary work of closing the cultural and economic gap created by millennia of patriarchal privilege, which was largely justified by religious texts.
And they are fiercely supportive of the LGBTQIAPK+ community.
They actually take the time in the guide to break down that entire acronym, don't they?
They do, to show just how expansive human identity really is, contrasting it against the narrow binary of religious traditionalism. They walk through it letter by letter.
Q for queer, representing those who reject the rigid male-female binary.
I for intersex, defending the dignity of people born with biology that simply doesn't fit neat anatomical boxes.
A for asexual, P for polyamory or pansexuality.
And K for kinky, defending the rights of consensual BDSM practitioners.
The underlying philosophy here is so vital. Why does a humanist guide care about BDSM or polyamory?
Because it all goes back to John Stuart Mill and bodily sovereignty.
Exactly. They argue that as long as an activity involves freely consenting adults, human love, pleasure, and identity should be totally and completely free from religious or cultural policing.
Which is the exact opposite of the dynamic Hitchens pointed out. Hitchens observed that religion is obsessed with sexual repression, with policing desires and inducing shame.
And humanism looks at that and leans entirely in the opposite direction. It views consensual sexual liberation as a fundamental human right.
But the guide argues that while those social battles are crucial, there is one ultimate humanist battle that literally trumps all others.
Climate change.
Yes.
Because climate change is the ultimate existential threat to the Anthropocene.
The Anthropocene being the geological epoch defined by human impact on the Earth.
Right. But why frame it as a specifically humanist issue rather than just a scientific one?
Because of the stakes. They point to the overwhelming 97% consensus of climatologists regarding anthropogenic or human-caused warming.
They talk about the critical targets of the 2015 Paris Agreement.
And they are incredibly blunt about the reality of failure. If we do not collectively hold the line on carbon emissions, global temperatures will rise, ice caps will melt, and coastal cities like Venice and Miami will literally vanish beneath the ocean by the year 2100.
And their point is, it doesn't matter if you are a devout humanist, a traditional Catholic, or militant atheist, if your entire city is underwater.
You can't have debates about morality if the ecosystem collapses.
That's a sobering thought. Therefore, fighting climate change, using science guided by the desire to preserve human life, is the ultimate, highest expression of humanist empathy for future generations.
So if you look at the board right now, we have the fiery, destructive anti-theist prosecution from Hitchens.
And we have the structured, empathetic, democratic defense built by the Humanist Guide.
It feels like we have a complete high-resolution picture of the modern debate.
God versus no God. Blind religion versus empirical reason. The battle lines are perfectly drawn.
It feels neat, right? The comforting childhood boxes are back, just with adult labels.
But here is where we throw a massive wrench into the machinery. Because we turn to our academic source, Stephen E. Gregg.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting.
He looks at this entire debate. He looks at Hitchens. He looks at the humanists. He looks at the religious apologists desperately defending the church. And his conclusion is essentially,
you are all completely missing the point. You are arguing about a ghost.
Gregg's paper is a brilliant structural critique of what is sometimes called the Oxford God debate.
Right. He is analyzing the public rhetoric of the new atheists, people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and A.C. Grayling.
But he is equally analyzing the rhetoric of the new apologists, the theologians and pastors who argue back, like Keith Ward, Alistair McGrath, and David Robertson.
And he realizes they are trapped in a very specific, very toxic feedback loop.
Gregg introduces a concept to describe this loop that I found absolutely fascinating, and honestly, you can see it operating on every social media platform today. He calls it the law of inverse dialogue.
The law of inverse dialogue. It is a devastating observation of how public debate functions, or rather, how it completely dysfunctions when the stakes are tied to identity.
The law of inverse dialogue states that in these massive cultural or religious arguments, both sides will almost exclusively focus on the absolute worst, most negative, most extreme examples of their opponents.
They completely refuse to engage with the best, most charitable version of the other side's argument.
They don't fight the actual opponent, they fight a caricature that is easy to defeat.
And Gregg provides receipts on both sides to prove this is happening. He points first to the religious apologist David Robertson, a Free Church of Scotland pastor.
Okay, what does Robertson do?
Well, when Robertson attempts to critique the liberal, secular, atheist view on sexuality, the exact kind of sex-positive autonomy we just discussed in the Humanist Guide.
Robertson doesn't engage with the complex philosophical concept of mutual adult consent, does he?
No, he bypasses that entirely. He uses a specific reading of Scripture and explicitly equates liberal views on homosexuality with bestiality.
He goes straight to bestiality.
He takes the absolute most extreme, offensive, biologically absurd leap possible simply to horrify his own audience and discredit the other side without having to actually debate them.
It is a bad faith argument designed for an echo chamber. But Gregg points out that the famous atheists do the exact same thing from the opposite direction.
Richard Dawkins being a prime example.
Right, Dawkins, who is arguably the most famous atheist on the planet, will publicly claim that absolutely no good has ever come from religion. None at all.
Which Gregg points out is just empirically, obviously false.
Dawkins is completely, willfully ignoring the reality of the volunteers working 12-hour night shifts at inner-city church homeless shelters.
He ignores the massive global charity drives run by religious organizations or the civil rights movements led by reverends.
Dawkins looks exclusively at the suicide bomber and completely ignores the soup kitchen because the soup kitchen complicates his narrative.
Which leads to Greg's central, devastating critique of Hitchens and the New Atheists. He argues that they aren't actually analyzing religion as a global human phenomenon.
He says they are trapped in what we might call an Abrahamic straitjacket.
The Abrahamic straitjacket.
Wait, so if I'm tracking Greg's argument here, Hitchens is basically looking at a massive, complex, global ecosystem of human belief, zooming in on one specific venomous snake in the desert, and concluding that all biology everywhere is inherently venomous.
That is a fantastic way to put it. Yes, he is suffering from a massive sampling bias dictated by his own cultural and geopolitical era.
Because when Hitchens writes God is not great, and when he famously declares religion poisons everything, what is he actually defining as religion?
He is defining it almost entirely as Western Abrahamic monotheism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Right. Hitchens operates on the unstated assumption that for a belief system to qualify as a religion, it requires a few very specific ingredients.
Number one, it must have a supernatural interventionist creator God.
Number two, it must have a dogmatic, infallible scripture that dictates reality.
And number three, it must involve the strict policing of human morality, usually enforced through the supernatural threat of eternal hell or the promise of eternal heaven.
And Greg's point is that this definition is incredibly, almost laughably narrow if you look at the globe.
The new atheists are attacking a very specific type of religion and acting as if they have debunked the entire human religious experience.
They want the enemy to be simple, centralized, and supernatural so they can destroy it easily with rationalist logic.
But Greg points out that they even ignore the complexity within Christianity itself just to maintain this simple narrative.
Well, it brings up the philosopher A.C. Grayling dismissing Christian non-realism.
Yes, Greg mentions Don Cupid, a Cambridge theologian who founded the Sea of Faith movement. Cupid advocates for Christian non-realism.
Now, for someone who hasn't been to seminary, what exactly does non-realism mean in a Christian context?
It means engaging deeply with the ethical teachings, the cultural rituals, and the community structures of Christianity, but actively, openly rejecting the existence of a literal, supernatural God out there in the universe.
Wait, really? A Christian theology without God?
Essentially, yes. It treats God as a profound human symbol, a unifying narrative, rather than an actual being. It's a religion without a realist deity.
And how does the atheist philosopher A.C. Grayling respond to this deeply complex theological development?
He simply dismisses Cupid as a celebrity cleric who is just making excuses. Grayling brushes it aside entirely because non-realism doesn't fit into the neat, supernaturalist box that the atheists have spent years building specifically to attack.
So they just ignore data that ruins their model.
Exactly. But Greg didn't just critique the atheists rhetorically. He brings incredible case studies to prove just how trapped in this box they are.
He provides examples of massive global religions that completely shatter Hitchens' definition of what a religion even is.
And this is where the deep dive gets truly mind-bending.
Yes, because if Hitchens says all religion requires a dictator god, infallible dogma, and sexual repression, we need to look at religions that have absolutely none of those things.
Let's look at the first example Greg provides. Hindu Advaita.
Advaita.
Advaita is a profound, ancient philosophical tradition within Hinduism. The word itself literally translates to non-dualism.
Non-dualism. It was codified in the 8th century by the Indian philosopher Shankara.
And it was popularized in the modern global era by figures like Swami Vivekananda.
To understand non-dualism, you first have to understand dualism, which is what we in the West are used to.
Right. In the Abrahamic tradition, there is a strict dualism.
There is the creator God and there is the creation, us, the universe, the trees. They are two entirely separate things. God is up there in heaven, we are down here on earth. A massive gap exists between us.
Advaita rejects that gap entirely. It focuses intensely on the relationship between two concepts, Atman and Brahman.
I want to be careful here, because Western translations often butcher these terms by forcing them into Christian boxes. If we aren't translating Atman as just a soul and Brahman as just God, how should we understand them?
A much better, more accurate way to understand it is through the lens of macro and micro reality. Atman is the individual consciousness, the micro reality of your awareness. Brahman is the universal consciousness, the macro reality of the cosmos itself.
Okay, macro and micro.
And the core mind-altering realization of Advaita is that Atman is Brahman. They are not two separate things interacting. They're the exact same thing viewed from different scales.
It's like a single drop of water finally realizing that its fundamental nature is exactly the same as the entire ocean.
That completely reframes the issue, because if that is true, Advaita requires absolutely no element of divinity in the Western sense.
Right. There is no big man in the sky judging you because you are part of the sky.
It requires no angels, no infallible scripture to tell you the rules. In fact, true Advaita demands that you actively strip away all dogma and ritual.
Vivekananda famously called religious rituals mere kindergartens of meditation. They are just shiny toys for beginners to play with until they mature enough to realize the deeper, non-dual reality of the universe.
It is a massive, ancient philosophical worldview that does not rely on a single shred of the supernaturalism that Hitchens attacks.
And the irony here is just delicious. Let's look at how this philosophy generates morality through the concept of karma yoga.
Right. Karma yoga teaches that the highest moral ideal a human can achieve is to do good work with absolute, complete non-attachment to the fruits of that work.
You don't help the poor to get a divine reward in heaven.
You don't avoid stealing to avoid burning in hell.
You do good simply for the sake of doing good, because you recognize the interconnectedness of all things.
Which is precisely the ethical framework that the secular humanists in Italy were advocating for. They called it good without a god.
Exactly. This ancient Eastern religious philosophy maps perfectly onto the modern secular atheist morality. It arrives at the exact same destination without needing a creator god.
And yet, how does Christopher Hitchens treat these vast Eastern traditions in his manifesto?
He literally dismisses them in a passing sentence as mere spiritual tourism.
He willfully ignores the deep philosophical alignment because acknowledging a religion that doesn't rely on a toxic supernatural dictator ruins his entire thesis.
He cannot engage with it because it breaks his categories. But Gregg recognizes that ancient Hinduism might feel too abstract or too disconnected for some Western critics.
So he provides a second case study, one that is incredibly modern, highly specific, and frankly, deeply strained.
The International Raelian Movement.
This movement was founded in France in 1973 by a former sports car journalist named Claude Vorillant, who later took the name Riel.
Riel claimed he had an encounter in the French countryside with extraterrestrial beings.
Now, these beings supposedly told him the true translation of the Book of Genesis. They claimed that the word Elohim in the original Hebrew Bible, which is traditionally translated by the West as God, actually translates to those who come from the sky.
The Raelians believe that human beings, and indeed all life on Earth, were not created by divine magic, but were created via a massive, highly advanced genetic engineering experiment conducted by these extraterrestrials.
And they believed that Yahweh was not a supernatural, omnipotent God, but simply the elected leader of the Elohim Scientific Council.
Now, if you are listening to this, you might hear that and think, okay, this is a UFO cult. What on earth does a UFO cult have to do with Christopher Hitchens and this serious academic debate over atheism?
But here's the kicker, and it's why Gregg includes them. The Raelians are explicitly, proudly, and militantly atheist.
They are positive atheists.
They absolutely, unequivocally deny the existence of any supernatural realm, any invisible spirit, or any divine creator. They believe exclusively in the physical, material universe and the power of highly advanced science and genetic engineering.
They are so committed to this that they participate in what's called the blasphemy challenge.
Oh, this is wild.
In Christian theology, there is a passage in the New Testament that says blaspheming against the Holy Spirit is the one unforgivable sin that guarantees eternal damnation.
And the Raelians, including their top international leaders, publicly record and post videos of themselves explicitly denying the existence of the Holy Spirit.
They do this specifically to prove to the world, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there is no supernatural realm to strike them down with lightning.
And this proudly atheist extraterrestrial belief system is completely devastating to Hitchens' argument because it shatters every single metric he uses to claim that religion poisons everything.
Let's actually test that. Let's hold the Raelians up to Hitchens' own metrics.
Okay.
Hitchens says religion relies on the coercive, terrifying indoctrination of young children before they can think for themselves. How do the Raelians handle kids?
The Raelian movement explicitly, doctrinally forbids the religious indoctrination of children. Their texts mandate that children cannot be baptized, they cannot be circumcised, and they cannot be forced into any religious act by their parents. They believe humans must wait until they reach full intellectual maturity to rationally and freely choose a belief system for themselves.
Okay, what about sex? Hitchens says religion is defined by dangerous sexual repression, homophobia, and enforced shame.
The Realians are radically, almost aggressively sex positive. They view human sexuality not as a sin to be hidden, but as a natural, healthy, essential expression of our biological humanity.
They fully embrace and celebrate the entire LGBTQ plus spectrum, polyamory, and BDSM.
They have zero taboos regarding consensual adult pleasure.
They even actively recruit sex workers into their movement without an ounce of moral judgment. And think back to the AIDS crisis, which made Hitchens so furious that Catholic and Islamic campaigns spreading lies about condoms.
In 1992, the Realians organized a massive public health campaign where they went into the suburbs of heavily Catholic Montreal and distributed thousands of condoms directly to high school students to promote safe sex and fight the epidemic.
Which forces us to ask a really difficult definitional question.
Right. If a group is proudly atheist, entirely pro-science, strictly forbids child indoctrination, and is radically sexually liberated, is it even a religion?
By almost every metric used by sociologists of religion, yes. They are classified as a new religious movement.
They have origin myths, they have a prophet, they have organized hierarchical structures, rituals, and a cohesive worldview that provides meaning and community functioning exactly like a traditional religion in the daily lives of its members.
But if they're a religion, it completely destroys Hitchens' central rule. His book is literally subtitled, How Religion Poisons Everything.
But here's a recognized religion doing exactly what the secular humanists want, distributing condoms to stop AIDS, fighting sexual repression, demanding bodily autonomy, and fiercely defending scientific atheism.
You logically cannot say religion poisons everything if this religion is literally handing out the antidote to the poison.
And Greg's ultimate point here isn't to say that the Reptilians are historically correct about alien geneticists, or that everyone should convert to non-dualism.
His point is that the human religious impulse, our desire to organize, find meaning, and explain our origins, is far too strange, far too diverse, and far too complex to be shoved into the tiny Eurocentric box of Western supernatural monotheism.
When Hitchens and Dawkins spend all their energy attacking religion, they're really just attacking a localized ghost of their own cultural inheritance. They are missing the vastness of the actual human experience.
So let's pull all of this together and zoom out, because we have gone on an incredible, chaotic journey today.
We really have.
We started in a quiet classroom with Mrs. Watts, telling a little boy that God painted the grass green to soothe his eyes, sparking a lifetime of anti-theist rebellion.
We traveled through the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition, looking at how a psychological aversion to pigs mutated into a tool of torture.
We looked at the Italian humanist blueprint for building democratic levees to protect our crooked wood from tyranny and anarchy.
And we ended up exploring the deep philosophy of ancient Hindu non-dualism and the bizarre reality of atheist UFO geneticists handing out condoms in Canada.
It is a massive amount of ground to cover, but synthesizing these disparate sources is vital to understanding the world we actually live in.
The true takeaway for you, the listener, is that the human search for meaning, for morality, and for a functional, just society is vastly more complex than a simple televised shouting match between God and no God.
The Oxford God debate that dominates so much of our cultural conversation is essentially a trap.
The law of inverse dialogue forces you to choose between blind, archaic supernatural obedience on one side and a cold, hyper-rationalist dismissal of the entire human spiritual impulse on the other. It demands you pick a caricature.
But the reality is, whether you rely on the rigorous scientific method of the humanists, the interconnected philosophy of ancient Eastern traditions, or even extraterrestrial origin stories, the ultimate goal remains exactly the same for all of us.
We are all just trying to navigate our shared existence in the Anthropocene. We're all trying to figure out how to live together on this rapidly changing rock without destroying each other in the process.
And achieving that requires moving beyond the caricatures. It requires having the intellectual courage to engage with the actual messy complexity of human belief, rather than just attacking the weakest points of the people we disagree with.
I completely agree.
I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. Something to chew on after this deep dive ends, something that builds on everything we've discussed today. We talked heavily about the humanist belief in the Anthropocene, the geological age where humans have the power to shape the planet.
But science isn't stopping there. We are rapidly approaching an era of transhumanism.
This is the era where technology isn't just changing our environment, but allowing us to fundamentally alter our own human biology.
Exactly. We are developing the power to literally edit our own DNA with tools like CRISPR, rewriting the code of life.
We're developing the power to alter the global climate through geoengineering.
We are developing artificial intelligence that mimics and may eventually surpass human consciousness.
We are, quite literally, acquiring the exact powers that ancient texts attributed to the Elohim or to Yahweh or to the gods of Olympus. We are actively becoming the creators and the masters of our own evolution.
Which raises a staggering, almost terrifying philosophical question that neither side of the God debate is truly prepared for.
As our technology advances to godlike levels, will the line between naturalist science and supernatural religion disappear entirely?
If we can engineer life from scratch, aren't we the gods?
If we do become the gods of our own world, what new humanist levees will we need to build to keep our incredibly powerful, deeply crooked wood from breaking and washing the whole town away?
It is a question that ancient scripture obviously cannot answer, but it's also a question that modern astrophysics and biology cannot answer alone. It will require the absolute best of both our scientific reason and our deepest human empathy.
Because maybe the most important question isn't why the grass is green. Maybe the ultimate question is what we decide to do with the garden now that we are in charge of it. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us.
It's been great.
Keep questioning the binaries, keep exploring the complexity, and we will catch you next time.